He was the most feared man in Harlem, and the only person who could stop him from walking out the door was a woman who never raised her voice. By the time this story ends, you will not remember the gangster. You will only remember the man who could not afford to love her the way she deserved, and loved her that way anyway. This chapter does not begin with power. It begins with a street. Harlem, in the 1930s, was not a postcard. It was a neighborhood that smelled like coal smoke and Sunday dinners. It was a place where a man could be extraordinary and broke at the same time, where dignity was something you wore on your back even when your pockets were hollow. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the world would come to call him Bumpy, was born into a world that had already decided what kind of life black men in America were allowed to live. Charleston, South Carolina, 1905. The South, before the Great Migration, was not a place you stayed if you had something burning inside you. His family moved north the way so many families did, not running toward something, but away from something that was slowly swallowing them whole. Harlem received him the way it received everyone. Without ceremony, without promise, just a door that swung open and dared you to make something of yourself before it swung shut again. He was not a large man physically. Those who knew him in his early years describe something else entirely: a stillness, a quality of attention that made people uneasy without knowing exactly why. He listened in a way that felt like being read. He spoke rarely, and when he did, the room adjusted. But this chapter is not about what Harlem made of Bumpy Johnson. It is about what Harlem meant to him. The neighborhood was not backdrop, it was identity. The barbershops on Lenox Avenue where men argued about Joe Louis and Langston Hughes in the same breath. The churches whose music escaped through cracked windows on Sunday mornings and filled the block with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The numbers, runners, and the school teachers, and the jazz musicians, and the women who raised children alone and never once asked to be called heroic, all of them existed in the same 5 square miles and called it home. Bumpy Johnson absorbed all of it. The beauty and the brutality of it. The way the same block could produce a poet and a predator and never see the contradiction. He was already known on those streets before he became powerful on them. Known not only for the things that would later fill police reports, but for something quieter, a reputation for a certain kind of fairness that was hard to articulate, but easy to feel. If you were a merchant on his block who paid your dues, you slept at night. If you were a child whose mother could not make rent, sometimes the envelope appeared under the door without explanation. This was not charity. This was something older than charity. This was what happens when a man who grew up watching his own people be crushed decides without ever saying it out loud that on his block, in his Harlem, that particular story ends differently. But beneath all of it, the reputation, the reach, the slowly building mythology, there was a private life that Harlem rarely saw clearly. There was a woman. There had always been a woman. Her name was Mayme Hatcher. And this is where the real story begins. Mayme Hatcher did not come from nothing. That needs to be said clearly, because history has a habit of flattening the women who loved complicated men, reducing them to footnotes, to loyal shadows, to decorative grief. Mayme was none of those things. She came to Harlem the way Bumpy did, carrying a life behind her that nobody on the new block needed to know about. She was sharp in a way that had nothing to do with schooling. Though she was educated, she understood people. She could read a room the way some people read weather, not the obvious signs, but the pressure shifts, the slight changes in temperature that told you something was coming before it arrived. She was beautiful in a way that photographs from the era capture only partially. What they cannot capture is the quality of her presence, the sense that she had decided, at some point before you met her, exactly who she was going to be, and nothing that happened afterward was going to renegotiate that decision. When she met Ellsworth Johnson, she was not naive about who he was. She was not rescued by him. She was not swept away. She chose him, with full information and open eyes. That distinction matters enormously, because what followed the decades of waiting, of prison visits, of raising a household and a reputation in his absence, of standing in rooms where men twice her age deferred to her because they understood that she carried his authority when he could not carry it himself. None of that was something that happened to Mayme Hatcher. She built it, deliberately, brick by brick. The Harlem that knew Bumpy Johnson also knew, quietly, that Mayme was not to be underestimated. There are women in every community who become the institutional memory of a place who hold the truth about events, relationships, and debts in their minds long after the men involved have either died or chosen to forget. Mayme was that woman for this particular world. She kept his correspondence during his years in prison. She managed relationships. She maintained dignity under a kind of public scrutiny that would have dismantled someone less certain of herself. And she loved him, not blindly, not without cost, but completely. The question that this story is really asking, the question that sits underneath every scene that follows, is what it means to love someone whose life is, by its nature, a danger to the love itself. What it means to build a home in the middle of a hurricane and keep it standing and call it beautiful. Their lives were about to become something neither of them could have planned for. Because the world outside their door was changing, and the man she loved was about to be tested in a way that would require him to give something he had never given anyone. Not power, not money, not protection. Something harder. There are men who show love through declarations. Bumpy Johnson was not one of those men. He showed love the way certain people show faith, not in moments of ease, but in moments of pressure. Not in what he said, but in what he did when saying nothing would have been safer. This chapter is about the specific and unremarkable ways that Ellsworth Johnson cared for Mayme Hatcher. Unremarkable because they happened quietly, without audience, without the weight of legend attached to them. They happened the way real love always happens in the daily. Accumulating detail that nobody writes down because it doesn't feel important until the person is gone. He was attentive in ways that were surprising for a man of his world. In that world, attention moved outward to rivals, to territory, to money, to threat. The capacity to turn that same quality of focus inward toward a person you loved, toward the texture of her specific life and needs, that was not common. He noticed things. He noticed when she was tired, in a way she would not admit. He noticed when a conversation had cost her something she had not named. He noticed the things she wanted and had decided not to ask for, and he addressed them before she reached the moment of asking, so that she would never have to experience the small indignity of wanting something out loud in front of him. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is one of the rarest things one person can offer another. During the years when he was inside, and there were years, long years, where Sing Sing held him and Harlem waited, Mayme managed everything. She did not do this reluctantly. She did not perform sacrifice. She simply continued, because continuing was what the situation required, and she was not the kind of woman who stopped because a situation was difficult. But when he came back, when the door opened, and he walked back into the life they had built together, he came back differently than many men did. He came back paying attention. He understood what she had carried, not in a general way, in a specific way. He knew which relationships she had maintained on his behalf that had cost her personally. He knew which insults she had absorbed quietly because making them visible would have created problems for him. He knew the precise shape of what she had given up and what she had held on to, and he honored that knowledge by never making her explain it. The gift was not dramatic. The gift was this. He saw her, completely, accurately, without flinching, in a life surrounded by men who needed to be the most seen person in every room. That was not a small thing. That was everything. The cost of this gift, however, that was a different story. And it was just beginning to show. The streets do not give a man to a woman. They loan him. And the interest on that loan is paid in the currency of absence, not just physical absence. Though there was that, the years behind walls, the nights that stretched into mornings with no explanation, but the other kind of absence. The kind where a man is sitting across the table from you, and part of him is somewhere you cannot reach. Bumpy Johnson lived in two worlds simultaneously for most of his adult life, and the weight of maintaining that separation, of keeping the violence of one world from contaminating the warmth of the other, was something he carried entirely alone. He never brought it to Mayme. Not directly. She saw the edges of it, the tension that lived in his shoulders on certain evenings, the way his eyes sometimes moved to a window for reasons she did not ask about. But the full weight of it, the moral accounting that a man conducting the life he conducted must perform, whether he wants to or not, that he carried alone. This was, in its own way, another form of the gift. He was protecting her from the darkest parts of his interior. But protection has a cost, and the person paying it was him. Mid-video rehook. But what nobody saw at the time was this: the man who protected everyone around him had no one protecting him, not from the streets, from himself, from the question he could not stop asking in the quiet hours, whether a man like him deserved the kind of love she was giving him. He had done things, not things he regretted entirely, because that is not how men of his world understood their choices, and simplifying it into regret would be dishonest, but things that, in the company of someone as decent and clear-eyed as Mayme, created a dissonance he could not fully resolve. He was not the only man who has loved someone better than himself, but he may have been one of the most clear-eyed about the gap. That clarity, that unflinching self-assessment was, paradoxically, one of the things that made him capable of loving her the way he did. He was not operating under illusion about who he was. He knew the ledger. He knew what was written on it. And yet every morning he was free. He came home. Every year he was not free. He came home when the door opened. The cost was not something he ever tallied out loud, but it lived in him. It aged him in the way that carried weight ages a man, not visibly at first, and then all at once. Every love, no matter how real, no matter how durable, has a moment where it is tested down to the foundation, where the thing that has been holding is asked to hold more than it was built to hold. For Bumpy and Mayme, that moment did not arrive with noise. It arrived the way the hardest moments always arrive, quietly, in a season that looked ordinary from the outside. There were years, the late years, the years after the longest stretches inside, when he returned to Harlem, older, and the city he had known was changing in ways that did not entirely make room for him, where the accumulated weight of everything began to press against the life they had constructed together. He was not an easy man to live alongside in those years. He was never easy, but there is a difference between the difficulty of a man at the height of his power and the difficulty of a man who is watching the world he built become unfamiliar to him. He withdrew, not from her, but into a part of himself that she could not easily follow. He read more. He was always a reader: poetry, philosophy, the newspapers, but in this period the reading became something else, something closer to searching. As if the answer to the question he could not ask out loud might be hidden somewhere in the pages of a book he had not yet opened. Mayme watched this. She did not panic. She did not pressure. She did not issue ultimatums or make the withdrawal about herself. But there was a night, one specific night, that those close to them have described in fragments, never fully, always with a sense that the full story belongs only to the two people who lived it, where something broke open between them. Not violently, not with the drama that the movies have trained us to expect from moments of real rupture. It broke open the way a fever breaks, with heat and quiet, and something being released that had been held too long. What passed between them that night is not fully known. What is known is what came after. He did not leave. She did not ask him to. And something between them, something that had been pulled tight enough to snap, eased. Not resolved, eased. There is a difference. Resolution suggests the problem is over. Easing suggests two people agreed to carry it together instead of alone. Comment prompt: tell me, have you ever loved someone the way Mayme loved him? Not despite who they were. Because of the fullness of who they were, the light and the shadow together. Drop it below. I want to know. They came through that night. But they came through, it changed. Something had been named that had previously only been felt. And once a thing is named, you cannot return it to silence. There are men who can say the word love the way other men can say, pass the salt easily, habitually, without the word costing them anything. Bumpy Johnson was not that man. It is not that he did not feel it. Anyone who watched him and Mayme in the same room for more than 10 minutes understood that the feeling was present, substantial, undeniable. It is that the word, for him, had a weight that he did not believe language could carry. He had grown up in a world where sentimentality was a vulnerability, where the visible expression of tenderness was an invitation to the kind of people who fed on it. He had learned, early and thoroughly, that what you loved was what could be used against you, and so the deepest loves were the ones you protected most fiercely through silence. This is not a character flaw. It is a survival architecture. It is what the world builds in a man when it teaches him, over and over, that softness bleeds. And yet, the thing he could not say he said constantly, through every other available channel. He said it in the way he made space for her in rooms where she walked into them. Not deferring, he deferred to no one, but adjusting, imperceptibly to everyone else. But she felt it, the slight pivot in his attention, the recalibration of his focus, the signal, sent on a frequency only she could hear, that said, "You are here and I know it, and everything is different because of it." He said it in the way he remembered things, details about her life, her preferences, her history held with a precision that was, for a man with as much occupying his mind as Bumpy Johnson carried, its own kind of declaration. He said it in the letters he wrote during the years in prison. Those letters, what has been seen of them, are not love letters in the conventional sense. They are not flowery or adorned. They are direct. They address practical matters. They offer instruction and inquiry in equal measure. But underneath the practicality, underneath the logistics of managing a life across a prison wall, there is a current that runs through every sentence. I am thinking about you. I know your life is hard. I know what this costs you. I am not unaware. I am not absent, even when I am absent. Micro pause. 3 seconds. Her photograph, held in a hand. Nothing said, because there is a kind of communication that language diminishes, and Ellsworth Johnson knew somewhere below the level of articulation that what he felt for Mayme Hatcher was of that category. He said it, finally, in the way he came back. Every time. Through every door that opened after being closed. That, perhaps, was the fullest sentence he ever spoke to her. Not a word, an action, repeated across decades. I came back. I am here. You are what I come back to. And she heard it. Every time. Fluently. He wept once. That is what the people who were present have said, in the quiet way that people say things they are not entirely sure they are supposed to say. Not breaking down, Ellsworth Johnson did not break down, but weeping, genuinely, completely, without the armor that he wore everywhere else on his body. It was over Mayme, not because she died, because she stayed. She had stood in the doorway. He had been sitting alone in the front room, the powerful man, the feared man, the man whose name altered the atmosphere of every room he entered, sitting alone in the early morning dark before she was awake, before the world had resumed its demands on him. She had seen him from the hallway. He had not heard her. And what she saw was not the man that Harlem saw. It was something underneath that, something that the years and the weight and the cost had not touched, something that was still, underneath everything, the boy who had come north with nothing, who had decided that his people deserved better than what the world was offering them, who had built something enormous and imperfect and real, that was still reaching towards something he could not fully name, she said. Later, in the careful, private way she spoke about him, that she had almost turned back down the hallway, that it felt too intimate, that seeing him that way felt like seeing something she was not meant to see. But she didn't turn back. She walked into the room. She sat down beside him. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not fill the silence. She just sat. And that was when he wept. Not from grief, not from regret, or not only from regret, from something that does not have a simple name, The feeling a person has when they have spent so long bracing themselves for loss that the continued presence of something precious becomes, in itself, almost unbearable. The feeling of being loved past what you believe you deserve, and knowing it, and being unable to receive it without breaking open, briefly, at the seams. He did not explain it. She did not ask him to. She sat beside him in the dark and let him feel what he needed to feel. And when it passed, they sat together in the quiet until the morning came in through the window and the city began its noise again. He never spoke of it. She carried it with her for the rest of her life, not as a wound, as a gift, the proof, more than anything else that had ever happened between them, that he was real, that underneath the name, the legend, the mythology that Harlem had constructed around Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, there was a man, a real man, capable of being broken by love, capable of being held. That moment is the true answer to the question that begins this story. The most feared man in Harlem, and the only person who could stop him from walking out the door. She never stopped him by force. She stopped him by being someone worth coming back to, and he, in the only way he knew how, came back. Every time. Until he couldn't anymore. He died in 1968, in a restaurant, of a heart attack, at a table in Harlem. The city he had shaped and been shaped by received him back the way it always did, without ceremony, without sentimentality, without pausing its noise for more than a breath. But Mayme remained, and what she carried forward, what the years after his death looked like for the woman who had built her life alongside Ellsworth Johnson, is a story that does not get told often enough. She did not disappear. She did not become only a widow, only a memory, only an appendage to a legend. She remained herself, fully. She spoke about him carefully, the way people speak about things they understand completely and feel no need to perform for an audience. When writers and journalists came looking for the story of Bumpy Johnson, what they found in Mayme was not a grieving relic. They found a woman of extraordinary clarity and precision who had loved a complicated man with both eyes open and felt no apology about any of it. She knew his ledger. She knew the weight of what he had done and what it had cost. She held both truths simultaneously and felt no obligation to resolve them into something simpler for the comfort of strangers. This is its own form of love. The kind that outlasts the person, the kind that refuses to flatten them into a symbol. What she kept of him was not a mythology. It was a man, the full, imperfect, extraordinary, flawed, loving, frightening, gentle, dangerous, real man. There is one detail that those who knew her mention, quietly, the way you mention things that feel almost too personal to share. A chair. In the front room. His chair, the one he sat in on those early mornings when he thought no one was watching. She kept it, in the same position, for years, not as a shrine, not as grief-made furniture, but as a reminder of a specific morning in the dark, a man alone, a woman who chose not to turn back down the hallway, the moment she sat down beside him, the beginning she always said of the only conversation that ever really mattered. Memory, in a community like Harlem, does not work the way official history works. Official history records the arrests, the indictments, the rivalries, the body count of a particular era. Community memory records something else. It records the merchant on 116th Street who told his son, 40 years later, that the man who made sure his shop was never touched was the same man the newspapers called a criminal. It records the neighbor woman who said that when her husband was sick and the rent was late, the envelope appeared under the door without a name on it, and everyone knew whose name it would have been, and no one said it out loud. It records Mayme. The women of Harlem, especially, remember Mayme not as a victim of her circumstances or as a cautionary tale about loving the wrong kind of man, but as an example of something they understood intuitively and rarely saw validated. That love can be a form of knowledge, that choosing someone fully with clear eyes and an honest accounting of the cost is not weakness, that the women who stood beside the complicated men of their era were not standing in shadow. They were building something in the dark that the daylight never fully illuminated. Bumpy Johnson's legacy in Harlem is layered. There are those who remember the power and feel only the weight of it. There are those who remember the harm and speak of it plainly and correctly. But there is another layer, quieter, further beneath the surface. The layer that remembers a man who read poetry to his daughter, who noticed when his wife was tired, who wept once, in the dark, over the simple, unbearable fact of being loved. History does not know what to do with that layer. It does not fit cleanly into the narrative of rise and fall, of crime and consequence, of the dangerous man who paid for his choices. But the people who lived near him, who watched him from the window for years, they know what to do with it. They hold it the way Mayme held it, without apology, without simplification, as the truest thing about him. CTA Legacy Reflection. There are people in every generation, in every community, whose full story never makes it into the history books. Not because it isn't important, because it's too human to be reduced to a headline. Bumpy Johnson was many things. Most of them were complicated. A few of them were beautiful, and the most beautiful of them was witnessed by one person in a quiet room before the city was awake and carried for a lifetime after he was gone. If this story reached you, if something in it felt like something you already knew, then you already understand why Harlem remembers him this way. Not as a legend, as a man.